Welcome to the Chris Levels Show, Politics and Prophecy. He will share with you his theme of living life based on principles and not feelings. It's time for a return to our Judeo-Christian roots of laws and repent from the progressive liberal philosophy of what's convenient and feels good at the moment. Join him as he uncovers and exposes the spiritual wickedness that is robbing us of our inheritance that Jesus Christ promised us as a nation if we are obedient to his ways. Here's the host of the show, Chris Levels.
You're listening to Politics and Prophecy with Chris Levels on WSNL Victory 600.
That, unfortunately, is the purpose of mandatory public education in this country. Unless you consider English an isolated crank with a rather too cynical take on the educational enterprise, you should know he was hardly alone in championing these ideas. Conan himself, building on the ideas of Horace Mann and others, campaigned tirelessly for an American school system designed along the same lines. Men like George Peabody, who funded the cause of mandatory schooling throughout the South, surely understood that the Prussian system was useful in creating not only a harmless electorate and a servile labor force, but also a virtual herd of mindless consumers. In time, a great number of industrial titans came to recognize the enormous profits to be had by cultivating and tending just such a herd via public education, among them Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller. There you have it. Now you know. We don't need Karl Marx's conception of a grand warfare between the classes to see that it is in the interests of complex management, economic or political, to dumb people down, to demoralize them, to divide them from one another, and to discard them if they don't conform. Class may frame the proposition, as when Woodrow Wilson, then president of Princeton University, said the following to the New York City School Teachers Association in 1909. We want one class of persons to have a liberal education, and we want another class of persons, a very much larger class of necessity in every society, to forego the privileges of a liberal education and fit themselves to perform specific difficult manual tasks. But the motives behind the disgusting decisions that bring about these ends need not be class-based at all. They can stem purely from fear or from the by now familiar belief that efficiency is the paramount virtue rather than love, liberty, laughter, or hope. Above all, they can stem from simple greed. There were vast fortunes to be made, after all, in an economy based on mass production and organized to favor the large corporation rather than the small business or the family farm. But mass production required mass consumption, and at the turn of the 20th century, most Americans considered it both unnatural and unwise to buy things they didn't actually need. Mandatory schooling was a godsend on that count. Schools didn't have to train kids in any direct sense to think they should consume nonstop, because it did something even better. It encouraged them not to think at all, and that left them sitting ducks for another great invention of the modern era, marketing. Now, you needn't have studied marketing to know that there are two groups of people who can always be convinced to consume more than they need to: addicts and children. School has done a pretty good job of turning our children into addicts, but a spectacular job of turning our children into children. Again, this is no accident. Theorists from Plato to Rousseau to our own Dr. Inglis knew that if children could be cloistered with other children, stripped of responsibility and independence, encouraged to devote only the trivializing emotions of greed, envy, jealousy, and fear, they would grow older but never truly grow up. In the 1934 edition of his once well-known book, Public Education in the United States, Elwood P. Kuberly detailed and praised the way the strategy of successive school enlargements had extended childhood by 2 to 6 years already, and forced schooling was at that point still quite new. This same Kuberly was an intimate colleague of Dr. Inglis. Both were in charge of textbook publishing divisions at Houghton Mifflin. Kuberly as chief of elementary school texts, Inglis of secondary school texts. Kuberly was dean of Stanford's influential School of Education as well, a friendly correspondent of Conant at Harvard. He had written in his book Public School Administration, 1922, that our schools are factories in which the raw products, children, are to be shaped and fashioned, and that is the business of the school, to build its pupils according to the specifications laid down. It's perfectly obvious from our society today what those specifications were. Maturity has by now been banished from nearly every aspect of our lives. Easy divorce laws have removed the need to work at relationships. Easy credit has removed the need for fiscal self-control. Easy entertainment has removed the need to learn to entertain oneself. Easy answers have removed the need to ask questions. We have become a nation of children, happy to surrender our judgments and our wills to political exhortations and commercial blandishments that would insult actual adults. We buy televisions, and then we buy the things we see on the television. We buy $150 sneakers, whether we need them or not, and when they fall apart too soon, we buy another pair. We drive SUVs and believe the lie that they constitute a kind of life insurance, even when we're upside down in them. And worst of all, we don't bat an eye when Ari Fleischer tells us to be careful what you say, even if we remember having been told somewhere back in school that America is the land of the free. We simply buy that one too. Our schooling, as intended, has seen to it. The next chapter I'm going to deal with is that we don't need brains. Between 1896 and 1920, a small group of industrialists and financiers, together with their private charitable foundations, heavily subsidized university chairs, researchers, and school administrators, actually spent more money on forced schooling's early years than they did the government. Just two men, Carnegie and Rockefeller, were themselves spending more as late as 1915. In this laissez-faire fashion, a system of modern schooling was constructed without any public participation or even much public knowledge. Motives were complex, but it will clear your head wonderfully to listen to what Rockefeller's General Education Board thought the mission should be. Its statement occurs in multiple forms, this one taken from a 1906 document called An Occasional Letter No. 1. In our dreams, people yield themselves with perfect docility to our molding hands. The present educational conventions of intellectual and moral education fade from our minds, and unhampered by tradition, we work our own goodwill upon a grateful and responsive folk. We shall not try to make these people or any of their children into philosophers or men of learning or men of science. We have not to raise up from among them authors, educators, poets, or men of letters. We shall not search for embryo great artists, painters, musicians, nor lawyers, doctors, preachers, politicians, statesmen, of whom we have an ample supply. The task we set before ourselves is very simple. We will organize children and teach them to do in a perfect way the things their fathers and mothers are doing in an imperfect way. And let me take a break here because it reminds me of what's going on, or what the Obama campaign, how they talk about organizing children. And it seems that in every aspect of our society right now, children are being taken away or trying to be taken away from their parents so that the state can control them, the state can rule them. But this isn't a new phenomenon. This thing has been going on for over 100 years as the progressive movement got stronger and their goals were more clearly defined. But in other words, they didn't want brains or talent, just obedience. Who is the we here? This mission statement of the General Education Board should be read more than once until the illusions about school, so carefully implanted in your mind, are broken. At the start of World War II, millions of men showed up at registration offices to take low-level academic tests before being inducted. Years of maximum mobilization were 1942 through 1944, and our fighting force had been mostly schooled in the 1930s. 18 million were tested, and 17,280,000 were judged to have the minimum competence in reading necessary to be a soldier, a 96% literacy rate. This was a 2% fall off from the 98% of 10 years earlier. But the dip was too small to worry anyone. The generals might have been more concerned had they been able to foresee profound changes being foreshadowed by this nearly imperceptible 2% decline. World War II was over in 1945. 6 years later, another war began in Korea, and several million more men were tested for military service. This time, 600,000 were rejected. Literacy in the draft pool had mysteriously dropped to 81% from 96%, even though all that was needed to classify a soldier as literate was fourth grade reading proficiency. In a few short years from World War II to Korea, a terrifying problem of adult illiteracy had appeared, seemingly from nowhere. The Korean War Group had received most of its schooling in the 1940s, while the conflict with Germany and Japan was being waged. It had more years in school, with more professionally trained teachers in attendance and more scientifically selected textbooks than the World War II men. Yet it could not read, write, count, speak, or think as well as the earlier, less schooled contingent. A new American war began in Vietnam in the middle 1960s. By its end in 1973, the number of men found non-inductible by reason of inability to read safety instructions, interpret road signs, decipher orders, the number found illiterate, in other words, had reached 27% of the total pool. Vietnam-era young men had been schooled in the 1950s and 60s, far more intensely schooled than either of the two earlier groups. But now, the 4% illiteracy of 1941 transmuted into a 19% illiteracy rate of 1952 was now 27%. And not only had the fraction of barely competent and competent readers dropped to 73%, but even a substantial chunk of these struggled mightily, unable to read a newspaper or anything else for pleasure. They could not sustain a thought or an argument, could not write well enough to manage their own affairs without assistance. Mute evidence of rising ineptitude is more compelling when tracked through the very minimal requirements of Army enlistment tests, because SAT scores are frequently renormed, inflated. Whether to conceal the decline or not, your guess is as good as mine. By 1940, literacy as a national number stood at 96% for whites, 80% for blacks. 4 or 5 blacks were literate in spite of all disadvantages. Yet 6 decades later, the Adult Literacy Survey and National Assessment of Educational Progress reported a 40% illiteracy rate among blacks, doubling the early deficiency, and a 17% rate for whites, more than quadrupling it. Yet money spent on schooling in real terms had grown 350%. Charles Murray and Richard Herrnstein contended in a national #1 bestseller, The Bell Curve, that this was the result of selective breeding. Smart people got together with smart people and dumb with dumb. If you're a eugenicist, that sounds just right, until you remember the inconvenient military data. The terrifying drop in literacy between the end of World War II and the beginning of the Korean War happened inside a single decade. Even the most fervent natural selection enthusiasts wouldn't argue things worked that quickly. The bell curve held that violence in black society was genetically programmed. But once again, data from outside the charmed circle in America pushing this biological reality was contradictory. My control group comes from South Africa, where 31 million blacks lived as of the year 2000, the same number as in the U.S. during 1989 to 1991. Civil war conditions existed in South Africa. Then how to account for the embarrassing truth that death by violence among blacks there was only 1/4 of what it was in America? A second corrective piece of information turned up as I was writing this. The data from nearly all black Jamaica for the year 2004 shows the literacy rate there at 98.5%, considerably higher than the 2005 American rate for whites, 83%. What might explain the sharp decline in literacy among blacks, if not bad biology? Consider this. During World War II, American public schools, first in urban areas, then everywhere, were converted from phonetic ways of instruction, the ancient alphabet system, to non-phonetic methods, which involved memorizing the whole word units, and lots of guessing for unfamiliar words. Whites had been learning to read at home for 300 years the old-fashioned way, matching spoken sounds to written letters, and white homes preserved this tool even when schools left it behind. There was a resource available to whites which hardly existed for blacks. During slavery, blacks had been forbidden to learn to read. As late as 1930, they averaged only 3 to 4 years of schooling. When teachers stopped teaching a phonetic system known to work, blacks had no fallback position. By 1952, the Army had hired a brigade of psychologists to expose what it believed must be mass fraud. So many were failing to qualify. As Regina Lee Woods described it in Checker Finn and Diane Ravitch's Network News and Reviews. After the psychologist told the officers the graduates weren't faking, Defense Department administrators knew something terribly had happened to grade school reading instruction. Why they remained silent, no one knows. The switch to reading instruction that worked should have been made then, but it wasn't. In 1995, a student teacher of fifth graders in Minneapolis wrote a letter to the editor of Star Tribune complaining about radically dumbed-down curriculum. She wrote that 113 years earlier, fifth graders in Minneapolis were reading William Shakespeare, Henry Thoreau, George Washington, Sir Walter Scott, Mark Twain, Benjamin Franklin, Oliver Wendell Holmes, John Bunyan, Daniel Webster, Samuel Johnson, Lewis Carroll, Thomas Jefferson, Emerson, and others like them in the Appleton School Reader. But that today, I was told children are not to be expected to spell the following words correctly: back, big, call, came, can, day, did, dog, down, get, good, have, he, home, if, in, is, it, like, little, man. And where is this nuts or what? So there you have. We're going to take a break and we'll be back shortly.